picture this. The President of the United States has just lost his re-election. He has campaigned himself hoarse, literally lost his voice, and now, on the single most humiliating night of his political career, he cannot even speak the words to concede. So someone else has to walk out in front of the entire country, stand at that podium, and lose the presidency out loud, smiling the whole time. That someone was his wife. Betty Ford stood in front of America that night, looking calm. Nobody watching knew was that the woman delivering that speech was already dependent on pills, already drinking to get through the day, already falling down in her own bathroom, alone, at night, with no one there to hear her. Here's the part that should really stop you. None of that started because her husband lost an election. It started decades earlier, quietly, invisibly, while he was busy becoming one of the most powerful men in the country, and she was busy disappearing. By the time the world found out, it had almost killed her. This is the marriage nobody tells you about. Not the one in the White House photo albums, the real one. Part 1. The woman before the marriage. To understand what Betty Ford's marriage would eventually cost her, you have to understand who she was before she ever became Mrs. Ford. She was born Elizabeth Ann Bloomer in Chicago in 1918 and raised mostly in Grand Rapids. Her childhood was not an easy one. Her father struggled with alcoholism, a shadow that would follow her, in one form or another, for most of her life. She grew up watching a parent lose control to drink, never imagining that decades later she would be fighting the exact same battle herself. As a young woman, Betty found freedom and identity in dance. She trained seriously, moved to New York, and studied under the legendary choreographer, Martha Graham. For a brief window of her life, she had a career that was entirely her own, something that belonged to no one else, built on her own discipline and talent. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, because so much of what came later in her marriage would be about the slow disappearance of that independent identity. Betty eventually returned to Grand Rapids, in part because her mother wanted her closer to home, and in part because the life of a professional dancer in New York was a difficult, uncertain one. Back home, she worked as a fashion coordinator at a department store and taught dance on the side. In 1942, she married a man named William Warren, someone she had known for years. It did not go well. Warren, like her father, struggled with alcohol, and he preferred spending his time with friends over spending it with his wife. After 5 years of a marriage that left her lonely and unfulfilled, Betty filed for divorce. It was a bold, even scandalous, decision for a woman in the 1940s. It also tells you something important about Betty Ford. Long before she ever wore that name, she was someone who, when a marriage became a source of quiet suffering, was capable of walking away from it. Keep that in mind, because a few decades later, in a very different marriage, she would not walk away, and the reasons why are far more complicated and far more painful than most people realize. Part 2. A whirlwind and a warning sign. In 1947, Betty met a young lawyer from Grand Rapids named Gerald Ford. Athletic, a former University of Michigan, football standout, and ambitious in a way that was impossible to miss. Their romance moved quickly, but almost immediately, there was a sign of what their marriage would actually look like. Gerald was already planning a run for Congress, and here is the detail that so many retellings gloss over. He proposed to Betty, but delayed the wedding for months, because he didn't want a wife to complicate his congressional campaign. When they finally did marry, on October 15, 1948, it wasn't a quiet honeymoon that followed. It was less than 3 weeks before Election Day. Betty later described going straight from the wedding into campaign events, at one point even being taken to a wrestling match as one of their first married outings because Gerald needed to be seen there. Politics, in other words, didn't just play a role in the Ford marriage. Politics came first, from the very first weeks of it. Betty would spend the rest of her married life negotiating for a share of a husband whose time, energy, and identity belonged first to his career and only afterward to her. Part 3. The Congressional Wife and the Loneliness No One Saw. For the next 25 years, Gerald Ford served in the U.S. House of Representatives. On paper, it was a long, stable, successful career. In practice, it meant a husband who was constantly gone, traveling, campaigning, attending endless political functions, climbing steadily toward the position of House Minority Leader. Betty, meanwhile, was raising 4 children largely on her own: Michael, John, Stephen, and their daughter, Suzanne. She later admitted that being a housewife felt like a far tougher job than going to an office and getting a paycheck for it, a line that sounds almost ordinary today, but which captured something real about how unequal the arrangement of their marriage had become. Gerald had a public identity, a title, a growing reputation. Betty had a house full of children and an increasingly private, increasingly difficult inner life that nobody in Washington ever saw. The toll built up quietly. After the birth of their 3rd child, Betty fell into a depression. It's telling that this depression is often mentioned as almost a footnote, a brief mention before moving on to the next political milestone, when in reality it was an early warning sign of a much larger crisis to come. Physically, her body was also failing her. She developed severe arthritis and a pinched nerve, conditions that caused chronic, grinding pain. Doctors did what doctors in that era commonly did. They prescribed medication, painkillers. Years before she ever became a public face of addiction recovery, Betty Ford had already begun a long, slow relationship with prescription pills, one that started quite literally from physical pain that nobody was helping her manage in any other way, while her husband was almost never home to notice how much she was suffering. This is the part of the story that so rarely gets told with any weight. Long before Watergate, long before the vice presidency, long before the White House, Betty Ford was already alone in a marriage that looked, from the outside, like a political success story. Part 4. Thrust into a role she never campaigned for. By the early 1970s, Gerald Ford was already planning his retirement from politics. He and Betty had an understanding, even a promise between them, that after one more term he would step back from public life and they would finally have more time together. Then history intervened. Vice President Spiro Agnew resigned in disgrace in 1973, and Richard Nixon appointed Gerald Ford to replace him. Less than a year later, Nixon himself resigned over the Watergate scandal, and on August 9, 1974, Gerald Ford was sworn in as President of the United States, the only person in American history to hold that office without ever being elected either president or vice president. For Betty, this wasn't a triumph she had worked toward. It was a promise broken by circumstances entirely outside her control. The retirement she had been quietly looking forward to evaporated overnight, replaced by the single most demanding, most public, most scrutinized role a spouse in America can occupy. She became First Lady of the United States at the exact moment her husband's career, and by extension, her own isolation within that career, reached its absolute peak. And almost immediately, another blow landed. Weeks into her husband's presidency, Betty was diagnosed with breast cancer. She made an extraordinary choice rather than hiding it. As most public figures of that era would have done, she spoke about it openly, underwent a mastectomy, and talked candidly about her treatment. Her honesty is credited with encouraging countless American women to seek breast cancer screenings they might otherwise have avoided. Out of fear or shame, it's worth pausing on the strange cruelty of the timing. Betty Ford's greatest act of public courage, her openness about cancer, came during one of the most physically and emotionally brutal periods of her life. While she was already quietly dependent on medication, already carrying years of unaddressed loneliness, and already navigating a marriage in which her husband's attention was split between her and the entire nation. Part 5. The isolation got worse, not better. You might expect that once Gerald Ford lost his re-election bid in 1976, left the White House. Life would have finally slowed down, and Betty would have found some relief. The opposite happened. The Fords relocated to Rancho Mirage, California. Their 4 children, now grown, were out of the house and living their own lives. And Gerald, rather than settling into a quiet retirement, remained almost constantly busy, serving on corporate boards, giving speeches, traveling for business and public appearances. The pattern of their marriage, established decades earlier during his years in Congress, simply repeated itself in a new setting. He was gone. She was home alone, with no children to care for, no official duties to fill her days, and a husband who was frequently away. Betty's dependency on alcohol and prescription medication deepened. What had begun years earlier as pain management for arthritis had, by this point, become something far more serious and far harder to control. Her daughter Susan, living nearby, was the first to notice how bad things had become. Betty's speech grew slow and slurred. She shuffled when she walked. One night, alone in the house, she fell in the bathroom and injured herself. Her family began to fear that if nothing changed, they might lose her entirely. It's a genuinely sobering image. The woman who had stood in front of the nation just months earlier, gracious and composed after her husband's election defeat, was now falling. In her own bathroom in the middle of the night with no one there to help her up. Part 6. Denial and the Intervention. By 1978, Betty Ford's family could no longer look away from what was happening. They staged what would become one of the most publicly discussed interventions in American history, though at the time it was a private, painful family confrontation, not a media event. Betty's own reaction reveals just how deeply denial had taken hold, even as her family sat her down and told her, in essence, that they loved her and were terrified for her life. Her internal response was defensive. She reasoned to herself that her makeup was never smeared. She was never visibly disheveled. She behaved politely in public. And she never finished an entire bottle of alcohol on her own. So how, she wondered, could she possibly be an alcoholic? It's a devastating window into how addiction can hide behind composure, especially for someone who had spent her entire adult life being watched, judged, and expected to appear flawless in public. But her family's intervention worked. Betty agreed to seek treatment, entering a rehabilitation program at what was then called the Long Beach Naval Hospital. At a moment in American history when there were very few places for anyone, let alone a former First Lady, to openly receive treatment for addiction, Betty Ford went through recovery and then made the extraordinary decision to talk about it publicly. Part 7. What her honesty actually cost her. It's tempting, looking back with decades of hindsight, to see Betty Ford's openness about her addiction as an uncomplicated triumph, a brave, forward-thinking act that helped destigmatize substance abuse in America. And in many ways, it was exactly that. But it's worth being honest about what it actually took to get there. Betty Ford didn't choose to become an addiction icon out of some grand strategic plan. She became one because her marriage, structured for 30 years around her husband's career, her own chronic physical pain, and long stretches of isolation had quietly pushed her toward dependency long before anyone was paying attention. Her recovery wasn't just personal triumph. It was also, in a very real sense, a public reckoning with private neglect. The very structure of her marriage, built around Gerald's near-constant absence for the sake of his political career, had been part of what allowed her condition to worsen for so long without real intervention. In 1982, Betty co-founded the Betty Ford Center in Rancho Mirage, a treatment facility that would go on to help more than 90,000 people, including household names like Elizabeth Taylor and Johnny Cash. Gerald himself later reflected, Betty's name attached to the center gave it a kind of credibility and warmth that drew people in, an acknowledgement that even someone at the very top of American political life could struggle with addiction, and that recovery was possible. Part 8. Was there love underneath the hardship? Here's where the story resists a simple, clean conclusion. And it's important not to flatten it into one. Despite everything, the decades of political ambition placed ahead of her needs. The loneliness of raising 4 children largely alone, the chronic pain that was treated with pills instead of real support, the isolation in Rancho Mirage that deepened her addiction, and the family intervention that finally forced a reckoning. Betty and Gerald Ford stayed married, not for a few more years. For the rest of their lives, 58 years, until Gerald's death in December 2006, at the age of 93. Betty outlived him by nearly 5 more years, passing away in July 2011 at the age of 93 herself. There's real evidence that once Betty's addiction became visible, Gerald did show up for her in a way he perhaps hadn't fully shown up for her before. Family accounts describe him telling her directly that they wanted her to listen because they loved her, a moment of real vulnerability. From a man whose entire adult life had been built around composure and political discipline, he supported her recovery. He publicly defended the center that bore her name, and in interviews decades later, he spoke of her with evident pride and affection. So was the marriage cruel, in the way the title of this story suggests? The honest answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no. It wasn't a marriage defined by malice. Gerald Ford was, by every account, not a cruel man in any deliberate sense. But the marriage was structured, for decades, in a way that repeatedly placed his ambitions first and her well-being second, not out of hostility, but out of the ordinary, unexamined assumptions of the era they lived in, where a political wife's job was to manage the home, invisibly, while her husband's career took center stage. That kind of structural neglect can be every bit as damaging as outright cruelty, even when no one involved intends harm. It just moves slower, and it hides better, behind smiling photographs and gracious concession speeches. Part 9. The legacy she built out of it. What makes Betty Ford's story so remarkable isn't that her marriage was flawless. It clearly wasn't. What makes it remarkable is what she built. Out of its hardest chapters, she took a private struggle that had been decades in the making, one that grew directly out of loneliness, physical pain, and a marriage structured around someone else's ambitions, and she turned it into one of the most influential public health legacies of the 20th century. Because of her, breast cancer screening became something women could talk about openly, instead of something they hid in shame. Because of her, addiction started to be understood, at least a little more widely, as a disease rather than a moral failing, something that could affect anyone, even a former First Lady, and that could be treated with the same dignity as any other illness. Because of her, tens of thousands of people found a path into recovery at a center that still bears her name today. Betty Ford's marriage may not have been the fairy tale it appeared to be in official photographs. It was, in many ways, a difficult, unequal, decades-long negotiation between one person's ambition and another person's silent endurance. But it's also true that within that difficulty, she found the strength to be honest, first with her family, then with the entire country, about pain that so many people before her had been forced to suffer in silence. That honesty is her legacy, not a perfect marriage, not a fairy tale, but a woman who turned decades of quiet suffering into a public gift for millions of people she would never meet. Closing. So the next time you see that photograph, Betty Ford poised and smiling, standing at a podium the night her husband's presidency ended, remember what was actually happening behind that smile. Remember the loneliness of the congressional years. Remember the pain she carried silently through a mastectomy while her husband ran the country. Remember the nights alone in Rancho Mirage and the bathroom floor, and the family that finally sat her down and told her they loved her too much to keep watching her disappear. Her marriage wasn't a fairy tale. It was something far more human, and in its own quiet way, far more remarkable.